All right, looks like I'm live. So, hello everyone. Coach Robert here. And I was prompted to choose the topic for today because my friend Luis recommended this book, which is Fire on Board by Alexei Shirov. A little bit about Shirov. He was number 2 in the year that I was 2, which was 1994. So, ancient history for most of the people who are playing chess these days. But I remember a time when I was first learning chess like 10 years ago when Shirov was like a huge name, kind of the way that like Carlsen and Anand are now. So even though he was never a world champion, he was certainly a contender, and he is renowned especially for his extremely dynamic style. So the name of his book, Fire on Board, is a very appropriate title based on the way that he plays chess. So my friend recommended me this book basically because my style is kind of similar. I'm a very dynamic player. I'm not saying I'm like on the level of Shiro, of course, but I like to play in a similar way. I think we favor the same kind of positions. And another famous player who's similar to Shirov is Tal. And some people have spoken about a Latvian school of chess to which Shirov and Tal and I think Shabalov and a few other players could be said to belong. It's a school of thought that chess is a very dynamic game, and it's good to create sharp complications early on. So, of course, I'm only 2 games into this book, and I find a game that follows one of my own games for the first, 12 moves or something. So I thought that was really cool. And it even finished off very much in the same way that my own tournament game finished. So I wanted to show first this game that Shirov played when he was 11 years old in, let's see, what year was it then? He was born in 1972, so it would have been 1983. So saying that I played like 11-year-old Shirov doesn't sound like much, but it's a big step up from 5-year-old Carlsen. So I'll take what I can get here. Anyway, so in this game he played this big attack from the same position where I also played a big attack. So I'll put them side by side, and we can all take a look together. Maybe I'll stop along the way and ask you guys what you would play, just to keep it a little bit, keep you guys on your toes. So, hello Vedant, welcome. Now, this game starts with e4, although Shirov plays like any opening. And he's playing a guy named Zaravlev, who at the time was an IM in Latvia. And the atmosphere of this game is kind of similar to like the match between Capablanca and Corso y Principa. I think I said his name the right way. Anyway, so there was this match that Capablanca played when he was also very young, like maybe 13. And the decisions that Black made in this game remind me of the decisions that were made by Capablanca's opponent, who was the Cuban champion at the time. So first off, let's analyze his opening choice. So he chose French defense, but he chose one of the simplest French defense variations that you could possibly play. If he wanted to go complicated, after knight c3 he could have played this winnower. This would have been maybe a good way to sharpen the play and try to induce some mistakes from Shirov. Shirov even wrote in his book that in the next game he played against this guy, he made Zaravlev made it kind of complicated and Shirov just got creamed. So I think that his opening choice is already a strategic error, and Shirov writes about this in his book. By the way, I've gone in like maybe 9 games into this book, but I can already tell it's a very good one. So I definitely recommend that anyone who likes Shirov or likes sharp chess or likes chess history or likes the first-person perspective on chess and people explaining their moves, this is a book for you. So knight d7 is very simple. We're going to get an exchange of minor pieces basically no matter what in the next couple of moves. The pawn structure is already fairly well determined. Black probably wants to put pressure on d4 long term. White has a little bit of a space advantage. It's not too imbalanced, just a little bit imbalanced. So Shirov wrote that Zaravlev probably wanted to keep things simple because he's playing a young boy. This was also an attitude that seemed to be reflected in a game between Fischer and Reshevsky. And that game is very, very famous. Probably a lot of the viewers know that in that game, Reshevsky played knight a5, trying to exchange knight for bishop and go into an endgame, and Fischer whipped out an opening attack and won Reshevsky's queen very early on. So there's this pattern where before the year like 2000, a lot of the time strong players were trying to play simple positions against lower players. But I think around the 80s and 90s, this was starting to turn. Shirov wrote that this strategy is actually not very effective because it gives fewer chances for a young player to go wrong. So it actually might make some sense to sharpen the play against young players or inexperienced players, which is kind of what they're meaning when they say young player. Obviously, there are many strong young players. So after knight f3, knight f6, we're kind of cruising for a position that could arise via many move orders. So I'm just going to put it on the board. So this is all normal opening stuff, but there's another move that white could reasonably play here. I think it's pretty easy to find out what it is, so I'm not going to quiz you on it, but it's bishop g5. This move's pretty logical from a strategic standpoint, and Shirov wrote about that in the book. He mentions this line. And I think that he doesn't really explain in detail why it's strategically natural, but I think that it makes sense to try to get black to put their bishop in a more passive, less active position by putting pressure on f6, which menaces the king side. He does cite a game by Anand, which is insightful. So let's take a look at the next couple of moves, which are more or less forced. So here there are two moves that black can play, g takes and bishop takes. He wrote that bishop takes f6 looks more natural because you're not doubling the pawns, but bishop c8 is still not active. So he kind of condemned this move. It's too slow. But he also cites this game where Anand is playing white and chose queen e2 against Vaganyan in 1995. And in this game, if I remember correctly, they played it like a Scandinavian defense. This pawn structure appears pretty often in Scandinavian defense. And Anand played c4 and c5 and locked down the center. Black had played c6 by that time. And Anand eventually maneuvered his knight to its best square later in the game. The best square was on e5. In fact, after the knight arrived on e5, black just resigned. Obviously, he had played f5 at some point, but probably... I only glanced at the game. I don't remember it in full. But I think that the pressure on h7 provoked f5, which allowed knight e5 later on. So, there's this Anand game in this line. So if you're curious about this other logical way of playing, you could check that out. But anyway, on to what Shirov and what I also played. So, after bishop d3, you might think that d4 is under pressure, right? Like, black can immediately play c5 and trade off another pair of pawns and try to cruise for, like, Drawsville, maybe. But there's a very good move here for white. Well, I think it's very good, and it's what Shirov also played. If anyone wants to shout out in the chat what you think Shirov played here to answer this strategic threat, I would be very interested to see. So what do you guys think? I know Vedanta always likes to share his opinion, so I'll be glad to see that. Best move for white. There are actually more options here than I thought initially. I kind of thought this is very forcing, we don't have a lot of options, but we kind of do. They're not all equally good, but there's at least two good moves for white. Alright, so Vedant guessed the move. I'm not surprised, because Vedant always plays dynamically as well. It's castling. But Shirov admitted that these days he would not play the same way. I played this way, he played this way when he was 11. He said that modern Shirov, when he wrote this book, would play pawn takes c5. And I thought this was a little bit surprising, because to me, it looks like we're giving extra development to black, right? Because they're going to take with a tempo. But this frees white for one move to play bishop g5, which is again that strategic idea. We want to kind of keep pressure on this knight so that if they castle short, they're going to run into some problems. Like we might see queen e2, bishop takes f6, and queen e4, trying to provoke some weaknesses, and then we might see some pawn advances on the king side if we can provoke something. Things went down that path in this game as well, so we'll see more about that. So castling, and they took on d4, and I'm guessing that Vedanta already knows why they cannot play queen takes d4 here, but anyone who's interested or maybe watching the replay later on, you could pause and see why they can't just take this free knight. You guys are welcome to shout it out. What's wrong with such a move? Usually we like to grab a free knight, but here it's not so free. I once blundered like this, also with black, actually. I played this same move, queen d4, in a slightly different position, and lost my queen as well. The reason for that was mostly psychological. I was definitely familiar with the idea. It's just that I was very late for my game, and I hate being late, and sometimes I like play in a very haphazard way when I'm running in. I've had a few tournaments where I've ruined the first round like that. But that's mostly an old problem. I don't really do that anymore. The move is bishop b5. And it's check, so they don't have time to rescue their queen. It's a discover attack. The best move here is probably queen d7. But of course bishop takes wins a lot of material. So that's why in the game they played bishop e7. But Shirov criticized this move. He said, why play so passively? So maybe we could suggest some better moves for black. But some people are lurking in the chat, but we can't pressure them to come out. On Twitch, lots of people are lurking all the time. But what should black do? This is more interesting than who's in the chat. Since bishop e7 is very passive, I would think about maybe different bishop moves. Usually when you have more than one bishop move, you have to be very careful about which one you choose, because if you end up needing to go to a different one later on, you're going to lose some precious development. So these are basically our candidate moves, right? Bishop to b4 is pretty transparently not good, because there's more than one way that white can win a tempo by attacking this bishop, either in one move like this, or in two moves later on in the game. So we can kind of rule out bishop b4. Yeah, bishop c5 is definitely where it's at. It's at least threatening something. And bishop d6 also looks okay, but it cuts off this pressure on d4, so it gives white a free hand. I would say that bishop c5 is clearly better. Now here, white can answer in a couple of different ways. They can play c3, or bishop e3, or knight b3, and that's basically it. I guess you could move your knight to b5, although I don't see why that would be very useful. And you could play knight f3. I also am not totally sold on that one, because it interferes with your queen. So I would consider knight to b3 to be the main knight move. But after bishop b6, this bishop is very active. I think black is fully equalized. Very dry position now. Bishop e3 keeps some more life in the position, but again they can just play bishop to b6 in anticipation of some discover attack like knight e6. And again, the bishop's pretty active. In order to get rid of it, you would have to trade for this bishop, and that could leave you with maybe a worse pawn structure. At the very least, more exchanges are favoring black. It's getting the positions drying up. So anyway, they chose this more passive option. But this is a pretty typical decision. I think if you play this line, you're going to see people playing bishop e7 for sure. It definitely happened in one of my games that we'll see later. Bishop f4 is what Shirov played. And he doesn't give any comment, but I think this move is pretty good because I found myself in the same position a few months ago, like before coronavirus, back when I was still playing tournaments. And I was trying to decide how best to exploit the fact that they can't take the knight. And I was thinking, like, what does black want to do? I just found myself wanting to prevent e5 and looking to do some active stuff, maybe with knight b5 even. So bishop f4, very active placement for the pieces. Shirov almost always played with superb activity. And here he played rook e1, and he wrote that c4 was an interesting move. I guess the main idea with c4 is to stop knight d5, stop queen d5, just stop any usage of the light squares. And it also works towards an eventual queenside majority plan, but it's very eventual. Anyway, he played rook e1, which is much sharper. Hello, Melee, please. Welcome. We're taking a look at some very sharp game from Shirov, and later on one of my own games. So in this position, rook e1 is taking over the e5 square, so we're stopping black from freeing their play in the center. And it's also hinting at an eventual come over here and take the king kind of stuff. So black played queen b6. There was actually one game that I found that occurred before in this position. Of course, this was after I saw the Shirov game. Like, when I played the same position, I had never seen this game from Shirov because I hadn't read this book, and I hadn't looked deeply into this particular line. But when I was reading after I saw this game, I found a game where they played knight d5, and this gives a tempo for black because they have to rescue this bishop. But white could maybe gain a tempo back with c4 at some point. So it's a double-edged strategy, unless you play bishop d6, and then black's plans are kind of revealed. They just want to exchange more pieces and dry up the position. Now black actually won this game. After queen f3, bishop g3, white started playing inaccurately from the get-go. They played h takes g3. I think this is already a mistake. It makes a lot more sense to just take with the queen and start putting a little bit of pressure. And after knight b4, rook d1, they got overzealous with the initiative. Because I remember in this game they played like knight d3, rook d3, queen b6. Actually, no, they played queen a5. And here they played rook e4, sacrificing the a2 pawn for very dubious play. It was not really that good. Actually, no, I'm sorry. The way they played in the game that I found was with the pawn here, but then all the same things, like this. So this was the position they played. It was very, very dubious how they sacrificed an additional pawn. I think that Shirov and Tal and these other Latvian players, they get this reputation for just throwing any piece to the wind, but that's not really how it is, I feel. Whenever I read their annotations, like when I read Tal Botvinnik 1960, for example, another great book written by Tal, they have very rational strategic explanations for their sacrifices. They're not just giving pawns because it gives them one move or two moves. Alright, let's see. Oh yeah, Melee Please says, my games are always interesting. That is probably the highest compliment that I can receive. Now, at least receive honestly. So, in this position, they played queen b6, double attacking b2 and d4, and Shirov guarded both with bishop e5. Now, in the game that I played that we'll see later on, my opponent had already deviated by this point. However, the tactical themes remain the same, so just remember this bishop e5 thing. The idea is that if they play queen b2, we can play a move like knight e6, winning a lot of material to discover attack on the queen. So this game so far has been like discover attack palooza. I should probably also mention that they still can't play queen d4 for a different reason. Anyone want to mention what it is? Why can't they play queen d4 here? Something pretty simple, pretty similar, but they castled, so the move is not bishop b5 anymore. It's something different. Okay, so the move, I know the people in the chat can find this for sure. Bishop h7 check, and the queen is hanging again. The queen's always hanging in this line. So queen b6 is actually not threatening to take the knight. It's more threatening to take the b-pawn. Now, after bishop d7, black is basically finished with their development. They just have to activate the rooks. But if we compare the placement of all black's pieces and the placement of all white's pieces, white is clearly superior. They have the twin guns, these two bishops, dabbing on the king. They have more space. I mean, they don't have any central pawns, but there's no way that black can advance their center. So white, for now, has the spatial advantage. They have a queenside majority. That could be very useful at some point. And they're just generally more active. Like, black is not able to create any threats. This bishop's kind of a dumpster fire. Like, it's not really doing good. So, how do we improve the position, though? So, let's see what you guys come up with. I think there's more than one good move here. Or at least more than one interesting move. And, Shirov's decision is not necessarily what I might have played in this situation. So how do we improve the pieces? It gets harder and harder to improve your pieces when your position is better and better. Like, you can only improve so much on a finite board with finite pieces. You eventually have to strike, but we're not at that point yet, so it requires some precision to make the position better. One question that you can ask yourself to improve your thought process about building the attack is you ask yourself, what is my worst placed piece? And this can be a complicated question to answer. Like, here you might say this rook is the worst placed piece, but clearly putting it on like c1 or b1 is not going to improve this piece. Playing a4 also might be kind of premature because it weakens b4 and it's very slow. It gives black extra moves to play, like rook c8 or maybe even this rook to c8. Probably rook fc8 is stronger. Actually, this is probably the ideal setup. Just both rooks on open and half open files. Alright, melee please has it. Rook e3 is what Shirov played. I also thought queen f3 was interesting. But maybe queen f3 is more committal than rook e3. Rook e3 has multiple ideas, and one of them is actually the improvement of this rook. So we want to move the rook and the queen, but we want to do it in the most effective way so we can utilize the worst placed piece on a1. So rook e3 is really nice. And there's basically no tactical punishment for it because of that same idea. Like, if black plays bishop c5 here, which is just like saying, I want to take your knight, you can just ignore them. Like, we can play maybe rook g3, and after bishop d4, we just take it. We have that same tactic as always. It's just always there. Black can't create any threats because of this, until black wastes a move with king h8, and then white will just have a lasting initiative. So black didn't choose this. Black chose rook d8, and I think this is logical based on what I said earlier. We want one rook on c8, one rook on d8, right? And I think the reason for rook f d8 as opposed to rook c8 is that, first of all, this is building some pressure. Now there's a real chance to take the knight on d4 after, like, bishop e8, for example. And that brings me to the other reason that rook f d8 is good. It gets out of the way of these two bishops. Sometimes in the early middle game, you want to just tuck those bishops away so that they're not in the way of the rooks, and they can guard some critical squares. Occasionally you'll do this with knights as well. Like in the queen's gambit, you might put a knight on f8 to guard h7. Alright, so melee please says he's a scaredy cat. He wouldn't play rook e3. Well, I think after seeing this game, you would feel a lot more confident to play rook e3. Well, I don't know what you would play, though. I guess the alternative is, like, something very solid, like queen e2 or queen f3, I guess. Or, like, b3. Knight b3 is a very big concession, in my opinion. Like, if you go here to, like, take the knight out of danger and protect b2, I think black will just finish the development, no problem at all. There was a small threat with knight b3. I guess the threat is like bishop f6, bishop f6, bishop h7, king h7, queen d7. But even that is like, you know, it's easy to guard. You could even guard it by mistake. It's such a weak threat. So anyway, they played this one, and Shirov played rook h3. I think rook h3 is very to the point. He's basically like, the move rook g3 is like saying you can't play a move like bishop f8 because I'll play bishop f6, putting some pressure on you. But rook h3 is saying the real weak spot is h7. That's what I want to attack to try to provoke some more weaknesses. Okay, so here's a critical moment. How would you guys defend the black king side? The threat, I guess, in this position is like bishop f6, then bishop h7. So what's the most precise way of guarding the threat? Eatermaster, welcome. First, we're looking at a Shirov game that I found in Fire on Board. That's what we're looking at right now. And then we're going to see one of my games that I played. Right now, I'm just asking, like, what is black's most precise defending move? If you've seen this game before, here's a hint. They didn't play the most precise move, which is why Shirov immortalized Zaravlev here. It's the fine details when you're defending your king. Alright, so Eatermaster says h6. Any other votes? h6 is maybe a little bit scary because you could see some sacrifice on h6. Nobody's going to vote for g6? Maybe you guys are too wise. g6 is what they played in the game. But h6 is stronger. What Shirov was planning to do was rook g3. And we might see some pressure on h6 coming up. But after the move bishop e8, just opening up threat on d4, not in one move, but like eventually there will be some threat on d4. Guarding f7, there's not really anything here. So Shirov wrote that black has good counterplay in the center, and there is no danger of a quick mate yet. So this would basically be what I would consider an unclear position. White has to figure out some other avenue to find success, and the attack has kind of stalled. I'd say that favors black. It's much harder to play the side who was attacking and then have your attack run out in the middle. But it remains to be seen, like, why is g6 so bad? I think Melee Please put it pretty well. It weakens all the dark squares around the king. This is really critical because of the placement of this bishop. There's no easy way to trade that bishop off, so something could happen on the dark squares now because of g6. Granted, something could happen on the light squares because of h6, but it's a little bit harder to arrange the attack on the light squares than it is to arrange the attack on the dark squares, as we'll see. So Shirov started with a threat, queen f3, developing with tempo. This move was kind of in the cards already, so I don't want to go too much into it. Anyway, the most logical move is bishop to e8 to fully activate this rook, as we've already seen in some sidelines. And Shirov played knight b3. Knight b3 doesn't look that great to me, because I feel that I would want, if I had a knight on b3, I would be thinking maybe I could play knight d4. But it does cover up the weakness, and it prepares the move bishop d4, which chases the black queen to a more passive square. And the black queen is basically like the only active piece, so that's how it went. But here's a question. Why can't you just take on f6? Vedant says g6 loses because of queen f3, but queen f3 doesn't, like, win the game on the spot. In fact, after bishop e8, it looks like you win a piece, but why not? Or maybe it looks like you get your queen into a very active position, but even that's not really true. Anyone want to offer up why? Why can't we just play, like, 2 captures on f6? I don't think queen f3 is, like, a brilliant move. I think it's just a normal activating your pieces move. Like, we're steadily going to get this one involved. Or maybe on d1. So if you take on f6, they're going to take back with the bishop, right? Now, if you don't take on f6, it doesn't make any sense to take on f6, because we don't have any attack right now on h7. And if we give up the bishop pair just like that, and we give up our dark square control, it's just not logical. So the most logical thing after bishop takes f6 is queen f6. So we're a piece up. But then after that, queen takes knight. That's right. So Master got it. And after queen takes d4, not only is white not up material, but the queen is driving out all the attack on dark squares. So it's just not logical. We shouldn't consider this variation. So knight b3 looks a little weird, but it's kind of logical. Now after knight d7, actually I guess this is also a prophylactic move. Because if you ask yourself, what does black want to play in this position? The answer is knight d7, right? That's what they want to do. And we don't have a good answer because we don't want to leave the control of the dark squares. So knight b3, a bit of a concession, but it keeps the bishop very active. Kicks the queen to a slightly more passive square. And now here it's time to play a stunner move. What should white do? Vedant had a heartbreak game, it looks like. Said he sacked too much. Yeah, I've been there. You know, I used to play every game with a sacrifice. I mean, I kind of do, but not as much. Like, when I was a beginner, I would just sacrifice everything. And sometimes I'd win. Like, in one of my first really good tournaments, the team tournament in 2010, that was my first time ever playing. And I played every year since then. I got 2 biggest upsets by playing like that. Like, I had no idea what I was doing in the opening, but eventually I'd sack me. And it was great. But these days, people defend just so well. They're so well prepared. Even lower rated players. So some people say you can't play like Tal and Shirov in 2020, but I'm not sure. I mean, Shirov still plays. And if Shirov doesn't play like Shirov, who does? Alright, so it's rook h7 time. You guys got it. This move is like outstanding because it's the most logical move. If you ask yourself, what does black want to do? The answer is e5, to close off all the dark square control. So it's the critical moment to go ham and sack that piece. The tactical justification is pretty easy. This is a thematic way of finishing the game. If they play pawn takes h5, they lose their king, so they have to play king g8. And then we can see the crowning achievement of having this bishop on the dark squares since like move 9. It's me. So that's pretty cool. But they don't have to take it, right? This is the trick. They could play e5. And this is where things get really complicated. That's why I think rook h7 is an outstanding move, because it requires you to actually see this next part. Otherwise, you're going down in flames. Like, if you play bishop c3, this is an extremely bad move, because after king h7, you can give them a pretty little check, but after, I think even king g8 is fine. I'm not sure which one I prefer. Instinctively, I kind of like king g7, but my instincts have been wrong many times. So, let's not dwell on that. It's clearly bad. You lose a rook. White is scrambling for counterplay at the end of that line. But here, white's winning if you just play the best move. So what could it be? Bishop's hanging, rook's hanging. Around this time, Shirov had... He writes about this in his book, too. He had met Tal, who's from, his same state, and they'd done some training together, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember right. And so definitely Tal was a direct influence. It wasn't just like seeing his games. Like he saw Tal in the playing hall. Tal blew smoke in his face because that was allowed back then. So think Tal right here. Vedant, if you want to analyze your game, send it to me on Discord. We can maybe check it out next time. Well, Melee, please, you have good results against me for a guy who never sacrifices more than a pawn. But I'm actually starting to play differently these days. Eater Master says bishop g6. I'm not going to grill you on it, but it is bishop g6. Another fantastic move. So they can take the bishop on d4, or they could take the bishop on g6. It doesn't really matter. But this is super hard to figure out, in my opinion. Now, they played knight f6. But you have to see what happens if they take each piece. If they play pawn takes d4, probably this is the most straightforward. I didn't actually check this line ahead of time, but I'm pretty confident that we can just, like, take on f7 with any piece. I'm not sure if it matters which piece we use. We could also play queen h5. I guess it's just a matter of taste at this point. I kind of like queen h5. It looks very direct. It's building the pressure on f7, and it's threatening rook h8. For example, if you play bishop f6, we take right here. It's going to be lights out. If you play pawn takes g6, we get this classy line. And if you play king d6, it runs into knight b5. But there's another variation which is very similar to this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. If they play e takes d4, oh, I think I skipped, sorry. So after f takes g6, which would have been the move to play if you believed white had any attack at all, you would challenge them. But after rook takes e7, queen d6. Queen d6 is the best move here, because if you play pawn takes d4, we're going to run into queen d5 check. And some funny business with queen d4. Now, these lines are really, really hard to calculate ahead of time, I think. At least for me. Maybe I'm only good at calculating simple things. But after queen d4, it's kind of like you're threatening mate, but you're losing another rook. So, wow. At least the next move is pretty obvious. It's either going to be rook e1 or queen g7, so you just have to choose. Rook e1 check, you can rule it out because their king is going back towards safety with king f8. So it should be queen g7. Here, after king d6, rook d1 check, they have to go to c6, and we're kind of chasing them across the board. You can already kind of smell the mate coming, right? Queen a5, knight d4, and they're going to at least lose their queen because they have to step on d6. Only move. I wonder if there's a mate here as well. There might be, but it's nice to just pick up the queen. Okay. Now, if they play king e6, it's a little bit more resilient, but it runs in... Again, this is the line where I thought it looked very similar. Knight d4, king d5, and the best move here should be rook d1. It makes a lot of sense if you've seen any classical attacking games that if black's king is directly in the middle of the board, like you can't get any more in the middle of the board than it is. If this was a king of the hill game, black would have just won. Now, whenever the king's in the middle of the board and we have all the heavy pieces around, especially where like their pieces aren't playing, it's a great sign that you can make a somewhat quiet move like rook d1. Rook d1's not check, you're not capturing anything, but it's guaranteed you have to have some kind of great discover check. When you see this in your calculations, like if you were playing blitz, I think you would probably just play rook d1 right away. It's a very good sign. Anyway, so after rook d1, it's just game over. There's nothing they can play. So let's go back. So some convoluted lines here. But Zaravlev didn't seem to believe in it. He played knight f6. He's basically saying, I'm going to let all your pieces hang. You have no attack, neener, neener. What do you guys think is the best way for white to follow up? Yeah, in the other variation, it was definitely king hunt time already. Here, it's also looking like king hunt time. But it's a little tricky when all of your pieces are hanging. There's a famous quip from Mikhail Tal that if all of your pieces are hanging, they can only take them one at a time. So this is the kind of position we're looking at here. But you need to make something of this temporary moment. Thanks for the feedback on the mic. Is this better? I can't really speak louder because I don't want to disturb anyone around here. You have volume control for that reason. Alright, so rook e1 was played. I think this is an outstanding move. We identified this as the worst placed piece early on. And if all of your pieces are hanging and you're going to lose some of them anyway, why not just activate the rook? Of course, you have to ask yourself what happens if they take your bishop, what happens if they take your other bishop, but the answer is that if they take any of those pieces, they're going to lose the game. I guess the most obvious move for black would be pawn takes d4. Because if they play rook takes d4, you can at least just take it with the knight. So if you're feeling very greedy, it's pawn takes d4. So I would probably check this line first. But the refutation is, again, the same kind of idea that we saw before. Here we can't play queen h5 because of knight takes h5, but queen h3 is just as good. Same kind of threat. Black does have some extra resources to try to defend, but they just don't work. It's pretty easy to work that out. The knight's position on b3 actually turns out to be very convenient. It makes you wonder if he planned it ahead of time, but I think he didn't. So if they play something obvious like pawn takes g6, we're just going to play that same... Actually, maybe not the same thing. I was thinking rook h8, like same old same. But rook takes e7 looks very, very good. I'm just going to play rook g7, and there's going to be a checkmate somehow, some way. Or even just rook h8 right away. If they did not have this pawn on d4, they would be more happy because they could play rook d1, but the pawn on d4 turned into a liability. So queen f4 is a lot more strong, but it hangs his bishop on e7, and it doesn't directly address any of the threats to the king. So rook takes e7, and white's attack just keeps coming. Probably you could already just call this a winning position for white. Of course, there's more analysis, but let's steam ahead. They played rook takes d4. The other critical move was pawn takes g4. I'm sorry, pawn takes g6. But obviously, after bishop takes e5, all the attacking on the dark squares is going to keep rolling. Queen d7 does create a threat here, though. So you have to see bishop takes f6, and they can't take back to understand exactly how winning this is. So they played rook d4. We've kind of eliminated the other moves, so rook d4 is the most logical. Knight d4 is very logical too. And Shirov wrote that e takes d4 was the best practical try. They played knight takes h7 in the actual game. After pawn d4, I guess he's saying this is the most practical because it's going to be most challenging for white to find a concrete winning line. Queen h3 is at least obvious to start. But after queen f4, I think that with the extra pieces off the board, this threat of queen c8 is, queen c1 is a little bit more, has a little bit more pulp to it. We can't just play rook e7 like in the other line. So how should we continue here? What do you guys think? We would probably want to play rook e7, but it's not available. This is back rank threat. But if we're too slow, they can either take on g6 or improve their pieces and defend. So what is the way? The idea for queen f4 is actually not just queen c1. It's to stop a checkmate involving rook h8 and queen h6. So it's guarding the dark squares, not just creating a threat. Alright, so Master says he doesn't know. Can't blame you. It's a really tough position. But it's so tempting to play rook h8, right? Because if you play rook h8, they have to play king g7, starting to look like checkmate. Well, we need some more resources. So it makes sense to also just start looking at some other forcing options. Like maybe there's more than one way to win the game. Maybe it's not mate. It's always good to ask the question, what are the worst placed pieces? Maybe this is a hint. Vedant G3 looks kind of interesting. I'm wondering if it doesn't have some kind of, like, big refutation, though. For example, Queen D2. I guess you could play Rook takes E7 then, right? G3, Queen F3 also looks pretty scrumptious, with the idea of Bishop C6. Let's take a look at it on the board. G3, if I play Queen to D2, I think there might be a perpetual or something. Queen F3 also looks very ambitious, but let's just say it's Queen D2, right? Forcing Rook E7. We're still guarding H6, so I think Rook E7 is basically the only idea. After Queen D1 check, you could play Queen to F1, but after the exchange, we could play Pawn takes G6. How does that position look? I think that I can't tell if White's doing well or not, because they have 2 extra pawns. They have 2 rooks on the 7th. One of them's hanging. They could fix that pretty easily. They could win another pawn. Yeah, maybe White's winning here too. So maybe it's okay. Maybe Queen D2 is not so awesome. Queen F3 runs into Rook H8. I wonder what's up with this. Maybe Bishop D7. This doesn't look that good either. Yeah, maybe G3 is also a good move, but Shirov wrote in this variation. Bishop F7. And then Rook H8, just picking up the rook. So he said White has a clear edge here. Queen H8 is on the menu. Rooks are doing well. Bishop on E7 is hanging. So maybe G3 is also okay, but Bishop takes F7 is very, very direct. Shirov occasionally writes about how he likes to show the most direct way of doing stuff. I don't know if that's true in his later career. I think it is, but I don't know if how he feels about it exactly. I haven't finished the book yet. But anyway, after knight d4, they played knight h7, which was not the big test. Here, after bishop h7, king h7, black's king has no clothes. After queen h5 and knight f5, black chose to overstep the time limit rather than suffer defeat. But there's no defense here. It's pretty apparent just looking at the position that black is not doing well. A sample line, let's say they play bishop f6. Just trying to guard all the dark squares. Rook e3 is very simple. There are no threats from black here. Eater Master says use the engine. Nope. I don't need any engine. Not unless I've analyzed the position already. Then I can check the engine. Another option that they could try is f6. But after... By the way, f6 is a discover attack. That's kind of the idea. We want to guard the dark squares, but forcefully. But after queen g4 check, king f7, knight h6 check, it's going to be game over. I have to go here. And that's me. So this was the Shirov game. It was really nice. I like this game a lot. And it's a game that you can't find unless you read this book, which is Fire on Board. I believe this game is... I know it's not in Mega Database, and I think that this game is maybe only posted in an Informant somewhere. Like really old Informant stuff with symbols, like no explanation. So, read this book. Now, I want to show you guys my own game, which is extremely similar. It's so similar that we can skip like the first 12 moves. I was playing white, and this was in Liberty Bell this year. And I was playing tournaments actively until coronavirus hit, and just because I want to be very cautious, since people in my family easily get sick, I'm not playing any tournaments until I have a vaccine and everything's quiet down. So this position is identical to the Shirov Zarovlev game. I'm sorry, Zarovlev. I mispronounced his name. And my opponent went in for the same idea, and I used the same tactical resource to prevent black from further developing. It probably also makes sense to talk about why they can't play e5 right away. Their problem stemmed mostly from not being able to play e5, but here it just runs into tactical problems. They haven't castled their king. Hello, Dinesh. Welcome. I'm probably going to end the stream right after I show you guys this game, just because I've got other stuff I need to do. But I'm hoping to do a simul next week, so if you want more chess action on the stream, make sure you voice your opinion in the Discord about when is a good time for a simul. I think we've pretty much agreed on Tuesday at like 7 Eastern time, something like that. So I will probably announce it on YouTube as well as a premiere. So I played like identically. I think the first moment where my opponent didn't play the same way as in the Shirov game is here. He played bishop d7, but it ends up transposing anyway, because I played queen f3 just like Shirov did, and queen b6. Queen b6 is what Zarovlev had played, and then bishop d7. So even this position is kind of the same. So of course I chose rook d1. This is where Shirov played bishop e5, so I guess I'm the one who deviated. I liked to put my rook on d1, like the same kind of idea, and I was just daring him to take the b-pawn. I think maybe that was a good idea, but I had a feeling that the compensation for white would be tremendous after queen b2. For example, after queen b2, I was expecting to play bishop e5, threatening knight e6. This basically forces them to grab another pawn with the queen, and I was planning to go in for queen h3 with some very similar ideas to the game. This provokes them to play g6, and after queen h6, rook c8, or maybe rook d8 is more precise. I would play rook e3. So you can already see the similarities. Like, when I saw this game from Shirov, I was like, oh my god, are you me? Because I play just like that. There are some champions who I see their games and I'm like, I don't get it. Like, I'm just not on that level, not understanding. Like, I'm pretty much like that with Carlsen's games and Karpov's games. Just super solid and strategic. I don't have that classical understanding. But Shirov, I'm like, got you. Let's attack that king. At least 11-year-old Shirov. Shirov is a great player. He can play any way he wants. So I'm not professing to understand everything he does. So here's an interesting moment. My opponent played e5 in a desperate bid for activity rather than play queen b2, which was probably better. And after bishop e5, I got into a little quandary. Actually, this was a planned quandary, so I guess it doesn't count. I knew my opponent had this resource, but I had carefully chosen my response. Let's see if you guys can find the best way for white to play in this position. I think Shirov would have done the same thing. It's very much in that Latvian spirit. So I think to consider yourself having gotten the idea, you have to find at least 3 moves in a row. If you don't find like 3 moves, you basically don't know what's going on in the position. Like, it's obvious that you have to move the queen, so we have to pick a square for the queen. The reason it's obvious is that we don't have enough activity with the minor pieces and rooks to give a checkmate. And we're not going to get a lot of material for the queen, so it makes the most sense to save the queen. And we should probably assume that they'll take the rook on d1. Otherwise, they're just like almost losing a piece if they play bishop g4. Because the bishop's hanging by a thread. Only the knight, who is also on pre, is supporting this bishop. Alright, Dinesh said, am I reading this right? Bishop takes g7. Outstanding move. We're going to just directly circumvent all the rules of chess and play bishop g7. And black will be so intimidated by your grandmasterly status that they will simply resign on the spot. Oh, you meant bishop h7. Yeah, king h7 is definitely the refutation for that. So it's got to be something different. And like I said, you have to see like a couple moves in a row here, because we already know what they're going to do. They're going to take the rook on d1. That's why they're playing bishop g4. Otherwise, why would they sacrifice the e-pawn? Sacrificing a pawn just like out of the blue, it makes some sense if only your pieces are getting active. But since there's a rook on e1, and the bishop is now on e5, just like in the Shirov game, white is also benefiting from the e5 sacrifice positionally. It's not a simple pawn sacrifice. They have to get something for it. Yeah, just to show it on the board for anyone who missed it, some people wanted to play bishop h7, but king h7 is nice. The idea that they had, I'm guessing, was knight takes, queen takes, and then we nabbed an extra pawn. But it wasn't meant to be. King h7 is possible. So what else? Alright, Eater Master is on the right track. Queen g3. After queen g3, what if they play bishop takes d1? What's the next move? Just like regular exchange sack, we play rook d1 or something different? What could the next move be after bishop d1? And I'll draw arrows. Alright, let me make it a colored arrow. Yep. So these are the two moves that we're imagining. What comes next? Otherwise, queen g3 is just like a shot in the dark, random guess. We need a good follow-up. Anybody? Bueller? I was somewhat pleased to find the move at the end here after looking ahead into the position, because I planned this ahead when I played rook a d1. Because I saw that they had some forcing responses to rook a d1, right? They could play queen b2, they could play e5. And so I checked out e5, and when I noticed this move, I basically said, alright, it's over. I'll win the game if they play bishop g4. The key move is knight f5. Alright, Eater Master just really desperately wants to sacrifice a bishop. If you play bishop h7, they'll still play king h7. Obviously, if they play knight h7, you'll checkmate them, but they have the king move. Knight f5, double attack. Attack the bishop, threaten checkmate. They have only one move to play that rescues, or at least delays their fate. And it's knight to h5. This guards g7, attacks the queen. So that's a typical idea. In some opening variations, this counterpunch can actually lead to a winning position for black, because you take back your share of the initiative. However, all the black pieces are hanging. Like there's checkmate on g7. The bishop on e7 is already free with check. And then after queen h4, the knight is also hanging. So this is like the worst possible piece coordination. Look at all these pieces doing nothing. So black is already toasted here. They played rook a e8, which I guess is a good try. You want to activate your pieces as much as you can. But I was able to just play the simple move rook d1. Queen e6, also good, because you stand a chance of maybe getting a back rank checkmate if white plays really badly. But queen h5 guards the bishop, threatens checkmate, so they can't even take on e7. They played h6. Now here, I think there's more than one good move. I'm curious about what you guys would play. What's the best way for white to convert this position? Can we like finish it off right now, or do something to make our lives easy, or something? All the white pieces are very active. The main problem is that there are two hanging minor pieces and there's a back rank mate idea. I mean, it's not even really there right now because bishop f1 is always possible, but there's something to think about. What are we going to do? We got options. I was pretty pleased with this move too. I'm not even 100% sure that it's the best move. But I really liked it, what I did in this position. Alright, Vedant has it first. Knight g6. I think this is pretty clear. It's just a one-move double attack. And the justification is that if queen takes g6, bishop takes g6, that's very simple. We're just winning on material and the attack rages on. And if pawn takes g6, it's more cool. After queen h6, again we see that pin motif, just like in one of the variations for the Shirov game. And then checkmate on g7. This is an interference move, knight g6, because it cuts off the queen's guardianship of h6. So in the game, they played king g8. Makes sense. We don't like to get checkmated. And then I was able to just take this rook. I also thought about playing some kind of intermezzo like bishop f5, but I thought it was too fancy. So I just went in for the trades. And my two bishops are really, really good, and it's looking like an endgame. So I decided to force off the queens. Probably there were more precise moves according to the computer. But as I've already mentioned, I don't care about that. So I did what was easy and logical. Threatening to trade rooks. And here I got a little bit, maybe a little too fancy. Probably I could have just traded the rooks and gotten it over with. But I thought my advantage was so big that I could play for Zugzwang and mate. So first of all, no back rank threats. No. Next thing, you don't get to use your rook ever again. Third thing, made a blockade. So now they really can't use the rook. And here I play bishop c4. They can't take it because of checkmate. And so they played king e8. And I chose what I thought was the most precise way to finish it off, which was rook d6. They still can't take the bishop. And it's kind of Zugzwang, because if they play king f8, we'll play rook d7. And if they play b5, I get to demonstrate another idea. Bishop to d5 and bishop c6, winning their rook. So they resigned here. I thought this was a really nice game, and the deep similarity to the Shirov game was very pleasing to me. Probably in like a wholly narcissistic way, because I just like the idea that I was able to play like a strong player such as Shirov. Yeah, extra points for style. I think that maybe we should start running chess tournaments like Winter Olympics, where people like hold up cards based on what they think your move was like. They're like 10, amazing move, or like 2, really bad move, or like 5, it's a prophylactic move. Effective, but not very entertaining. I don't know, something like that. We could rank the games according to a point scale and then give extra prizes for how entertaining and awesome your game was, in addition to who wins the tournament. Okay, so I think that this was good for now. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'm probably going to sign off now. There will be a simul, I think, next week, probably on Tuesday. I'm willing to play anyone of any level. I am happy to play everybody. I haven't been playing that much. I haven't been streaming that much because I just moved to Louisiana. But I'm going to get more into it again pretty soon, and I hope to see all you guys there. All right, till next time. Thanks for